Thank you, Daria. Good afternoon. I thought I'd speak at this one and not the next one. I think that quote, it certainly isn't exact. It's just to give you a general overall idea. And I think you can probably think of and name a few very wealthy families that have maintained their unity and wealth over time. You know, the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the Forbes, the Fords. But this is only a very few families out of the hundreds of very wealthy families that have been in the United States over our history. And so you can see that not many families are successful in that sense. But family unity and wealth preservation isn't only for the extremely wealthy. It's for, you know, the wealthy and for the middle class and for almost anybody. It's just we don't hear about it much because it isn't newsworthy. But here are a few things that successful families address. They work on preserving their family values. They pass down their family history. They support the needs of family members, not just financial needs, but all sorts of things that you find going on in a family. They work to find a method within the family to minimize the harmful effects of family disagreements. We can see that kind of stuff played out all the time. You see it played out with the Vice President Dick Cheney's family right now in public. And they work to preserve wealth. And it's this part that we're going to focus on today. I've got the softer part, and Danielle will get into more of the technical aspects. Here's a few statistics surrounding that. You can see that only about a third of parents think that their kids are in a position to be able to handle their wealth when they get it. Similarly, only a third agree that their kids can work together to manage it. And not surprisingly, 2/3 of parents haven't disclosed much at all about their family wealth to their kids. And in most part because they feel that it might affect their kids' lives adversely. But how do they approach this issue? Well, you know, as funny as it sounds, families create a family vision. And to me, this is a little touchy-feely, and it might remind you of, you know, a corporate mission statement that's sitting in the back of a file drawer, not just collecting dust. But actually, successful families do this. And it helps them create a shared purpose, and it also helps them with a starting point for making other decisions. One aspect of that just might be philanthropy. If you have a family vision, what are you doing and how do you organize that philanthropy? They hold regular family meetings. And this isn't, you know, the ski vacation or Thanksgiving dinner or that kind of thing. But these are meetings that are specifically set up to handle family business. They educate family members. And again, this isn't just specifically formal education, sending your kids to college or your grandkids to college. But they spend the time to educate their children and grandchildren on their family values, their family history, their family wealth, and they teach them how to manage that wealth. Not surprisingly, they create structures for handling disagreements, and disagreements happen in every family. But if you have a method of sitting down and working through it, it makes a big difference. And they work with advisors to preserve and pass down that wealth. But not only do they work with advisors, but they get their advisors to work with each other. Without any hands, please, stop and think about how many of you have an estate plan that calls for retitling of your assets. And out of those, how many have we not heard about? It makes a good deal of sense to have your lawyers and your financial people and your accountants talking to each other. The attitudes about providing an inheritance vary from family to family. Most people feel that it's a way to express how they feel about their children or their heirs. Some do it to protect their family wealth. Some are trying to have an influence on their kids once they're gone. For others, it's a family tradition or a moral obligation. And finally, some people just say it's a tax strategy. But there's the other side of the coin. Some people feel that they should not be passing down their inheritance. And we see that in the news too. You hear about it with Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are probably the two most prominent people that aren't passing down their wealth, or at least not a good portion of it. People feel that each generation should earn their wealth. And some people, the second thing, feel that they should be passing down their wealth along the way rather than at the end, so that they can ensure their children's success as they go along. On the other hand, some people feel that they worked hard for it and they're going to enjoy the money that they've worked hard for. People feel very strongly that money shouldn't be passed down. Some people feel that it should be going to charities. Maybe your kids don't need the inheritance. So there are a variety of reasons not to pass it down. In meeting and discussing this with children, it can be very difficult because, to sort of state the obvious, parents and children are at a different point in their lives and they look at things a lot differently. As a parent, you've probably earned the wealth. You may not be in a position to earn any more, or at least not by working. And you need it to last for the remainder of your lifetime. You understand the value because you spent the time amassing that wealth. And you're experienced investors. Maybe you're not picking stocks, but you've been working with somebody who's been handling it for you, and you understand what's going on. And you may have gotten to a point where you desire a legacy. Children may not be at that point yet. For them, the wealth is unearned. And they've got time to earn more, so if they lose some now, well, okay, there's time. They may not understand what wealth can do and what it can produce. They may be uneducated in investing, and again, the legacy might not be as important for them. There are some unique reasons not to have a family discussion about wealth. But the survey that we used found that there are some more down-to-earth reasons. Some people just feel that if you have a discussion about wealth, it's going to affect the children's work ethic. They don't want to discuss it publicly. In many families, people were taught you just didn't talk about wealth. It was one of those things you just didn't do. Some people didn't even think about it. And many people feel that their children aren't at a mature enough stage to handle that discussion. There are a couple of other reasons to avoid discussion. Not only the privacy between you and your children, but there's also a fear that children will start discussing it beyond the family. It could cause your children to come to you and just bug you about money. Could cause infighting among the kids. You might lose control. There are situations in families where the children have taken over and pushed the parents out of the way. Might cause a rift. And finally, it could ruin a family holiday. So don't bring it up next week. When we look at what people have done, only about half the people have disclosed something. A few haven't disclosed anything at all. And about a third have given full disclosure to their kids. But we believe that the reasons for having a discussion are overwhelming. The first is to communicate your motivation. If the first time your kids are seeing your wealth is during the reading of a will, you're not able to say, well, this is why I did this and this is why I did that. So your motivation can be imputed into it. And oftentimes, when reasons are imputed, they're not the right ones. And they can be very hurtful. So now's your chance. Now's your chance to help your kids learn about investment management. We do that. We'd be glad to talk to kids, either alone or if you want to come in with your kids, we'll talk to any age from 8 to 80. I hope nobody here has 80-year-old kids. It'll allow your children to plan. They might be making decisions based on their own finances, but if they know that you're going to be doing something like paying for your grandchildren's college education, they can make decisions now that better fit that plan. It actually can prevent future infighting if everybody is on board and understands. And you need to avoid lost information. Keeping track of where things are, account numbers, advisors, all that kind of stuff, you should have that information available for your children. You don't have to give it to them, but they should know that there is a central place that exists so that they can find that information. I think you've probably seen the newspaper with a list of abandoned accounts, and you don't want your name on that list someday. The minimum of what you should do is assure your children that you've done your own planning. You know, families can get contentious, but kids really do care, and the older you get, the more they are concerned, and so you should at least assure them that you've done the planning to make sure things are all set for you. Let them know how to find that information. And again, you don't have to show it to them. Just make it so that at some point, if they need to, they can get to it. And let them know the name of your executor. You don't need to wait until you have a will and estate plan to begin these discussions. In fact, having the discussions beforehand is important. because it'll help you collect your thoughts and put together the necessary information for your attorney to do her work. So let me turn this over to Danielle, and she can tell you a little bit about what she needs to do.
Thank you, Larry. Can you all see me behind here? As Dario mentioned, I'm a trust and estates attorney in Hartford at Shipman and Goodwin. And I view my job in terms of estate planning, which comprises of probably about 40% of what I do, as crafting a plan that has good tax consequences, but more importantly, disposes of your property the way you really intend it to. And these discussions that can happen and the tools that Larry just mentioned to take place before we draft those documents really can help us target a plan that truly does meet your needs and meets your intentions and carries out your intentions in the way you wish it to. And I know these discussions are not easy to have. As a parent of a teenager, I know it's easier than having the discussion about the first topic that Dario mentioned from recent experience. I'd rather talk about money. But nonetheless, it's not an easy discussion to have, but to the extent that you can have that discussion, it really does impact the types of documents that we might draft for you and really changes the form those documents might take. So I wanted to give you some examples of that. And I actually had an example within the last 2 weeks that kind of crystallized this for me. And I've been doing this for a while, but this kind of brought home the topic that we're talking about today. I have a couple. They are clients I've been working with for 10 years or so. They're in their early to mid 80s. They have 3 children. They live here in Connecticut, and they also have a home on a lake here in Connecticut, so a vacation home. And for the last 10 or so years, they've told me that this one daughter loves this house. She wants this house. She's going to get this house. They want to give it to her. They're going to treat all 3 equally, but she will receive this lake house as part of her share of the estate. And I said, are you sure she wants it? And we've talked about it, and they've assured me that that is the case, but they hadn't talked to her about it. So 2 weeks ago, we met to make some other changes, kind of tweaks around the edges for tax purposes to their plan. And you can probably guess where this is going. They said, we talked to Tina. She doesn't want this house. She lives out of state. She likes it, and her kids like it. These are the only grandchildren, by the way. And I think my clients envisioned the grandchildren going there for generations and the house staying in the family for generations. She's not going to come here. She doesn't want it. She thinks it's going to be a burden. She has the means, but doesn't want the burden of the expenses. And by the way, when we sat down and talked to her, we talked to the 2 other kids, and our son, who lives in California, he really wants it. No, there was never any mention of the son wanting this property. So that really changed the documents entirely. And had they not had that discussion, it wouldn't have been the end of the world. It wouldn't have been a complete disaster, but we would have ended when they were both gone with one child with this house they really didn't want, and would have had to make some revisions after the fact to the extent we could. So having these discussions really does have an impact on the documents that you might put in place right now while you're alive. It could impact the form that distributions to the children might take, whether it be in trust or outright, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. It could impact who you pick as your fiduciary, meaning your executor who's in charge of your estate after your death, or if you create a trust, who the trustee of that trust is. There might be issues between siblings that make it not a good idea to name 2 of those. These discussions and the family values and the family dynamics also impact whether and how charitable gifts are included in your estate plan, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And it also, of course, what we're really talking about is it impacts when and how much information the children or other family members should receive prior to your death about all of this. So some specific examples that I think will kind of emphasize how important the discussion is and how important it is to think about these issues, and perhaps to the extent you can, talk to your kids or talk to other family members about it. There are some situations that a child might have some special needs. They might have medical issues. They might have a disability. I frequently see it come up more with planning for grandchildren. Grandparents might want to provide for their grandchildren, in particular for education, but maybe there's one grandchild who has some special needs. They're not going to have the same life that the other grandchildren do. That may require the inclusion in the estate plan of a very specific type of trust. It's called a special needs trust, where we can plan to have the availability of medical assistance, medical benefits for that grandchild perhaps, but also give them other assets to really improve the quality of their life. So talking to the child who's the parent of that grandchild might flesh out these issues, figure out what is to be expected in terms of the needs of that grandchild or child, what the anticipated costs might be, what you think their life is going to look like. That discussion would be very helpful in determining these kinds of trusts that we might set up. On the other hand, you might have a child, and we all hope this, who has plenty of money. They don't need anything that you're going to provide for them, or at least right now. They're not relying on it to maintain their lifestyle, either now or after your death. That might be a situation where we want to create a trust and benefit a generation down the line and kind of try to minimize tax consequences in that child's estate. And certainly, different children might have different needs. Maybe this is just one of the children, but not both, or not one of several. And also, as I mentioned, the family dynamics and discussions might inform who you choose to serve as your executor or your trustee. You have the oldest child. You pick the oldest child because they're the oldest. I'm the oldest child, so I agree with that method. But you pick that child, and then you have a conversation, and he says, I just don't want that responsibility. I have enough to do in my own life. I'm very busy with my job and my kids, but I think the younger sister would be great at that job. Those are the types of conversations that might be helpful to have now. Or you have two children who have different skill sets. One might be the lawyer or the accountant, but the other might be the kind of like the family peacemaker. So maybe you want to have both of those children or family members serve in that capacity so they can bring their different assets to the position. Some of the other examples where these conversations kind of flesh out issues that should be addressed in the estate plan. One is, and we talk about this a lot, is concerns about a child's spending, or a child who might have creditor issues. They have a business that's gone bad or is going bad. They have a spouse that there may be a divorce in their future. They just can't maintain their lifestyle on their own. They're looking for help often. They don't budget well. There's all those kinds of concerns. That may impact the form of distribution at your death that might take place. You may want to create a trust for that child to help protect those assets that you're going to pass on from that child's creditors to the extent we can. And that's not an easy conversation to have with that child. And I know that. But in that example that I just mentioned with the lake house, they also sat down the third child who's had several businesses that failed. And they said to her, we're thinking about leaving some of this in trust for you and some of it outright. And she said, you know what, I understand that. I think it's a good idea. I'm worried about these creditor issues that I have out there. And by the way, I'm worried about my husband too. So the parents didn't even know that was an issue, but having that conversation kind of had those issues rise to the surface now when we might not otherwise have known about them. Larry mentioned passing down values in terms of charitable giving. That's certainly a conversation families have and we have with our clients. And that conversation may help to determine what form charitable gifts, if you're so inclined to have those in your estate plan, what form they might take. Maybe it's a simple bequest outright to a charity at your death, a distribution for whatever purposes the charity wants. Or maybe as a family you come together and you have a very specific purpose in mind, how you know what charity you want this money to pass to, but you come up and develop as a family together what purpose the charity should use those funds for. That's something that can come out of these family discussions all the time. Or you want more of a lasting legacy is the word we use quite a bit. That might be a case where you want this charitable giving to go on for generations. That might be a case where you create and fund a donor advised fund, or even maybe a private foundation. Those two entities are where the family can continue to be involved, continue even during life to make decisions about grants to charitable organizations, decide now how the money is going to be used, get them involved in the process so that they're a little more attuned to it after you're gone, and feel like they have the skill set to be able to help and manage those funds for charities after you're gone. And there are other kinds of tools we could use for charitable giving if you wanted to provide a stream of income to an individual, to a family member, and then provide for a charity. We can include a charitable trust. But again, those are the types of discussions to have now, to the extent that you can with family members, or at least think about in terms of the planning process, because they require very specific tools and very specific documents in the estate plan to carry out those wishes. Some of the other examples that raise these types of issues, we talked about concerns about a child's spending and about the spouse. But on the other side of that coin, maybe you want to provide for a child's spouse. So you have a trust set up and it's for the benefit of your child, then it's going to go to grandkids. Perhaps you want to provide for the husband or wife of your child in the interim after that child has died. Those are the types of issues that maybe a discussion with that child will help to determine whether that's a good idea or not. There's two issues that I realized I didn't include here that are probably the most contentious. 3 issues. One is this child living with a parent. About probably 30% of my practice right now is probate litigation and trust and estates litigation. So it's basically families fighting. So this is all aimed at trying to head off those fights, and having these conversations really does help to do that. I can't say it's going to avoid it in every situation, but it does help to minimize the conflict after death. But where we see quite a bit of fights is one where where a child moves in with a parent to take care of them, and where a discussion doesn't take place while the parent's still able to, as to what's going to happen. Is the intention that child who gave up their apartment to come drop their life and came and moved in with you, they're going to get the house now? And maybe that's the assumption on the child's part, and maybe you've told them that, but the other kids don't know that that's the intention. That's the type of conversation, to the extent you can, to have now rather than later, so that when the kids read the will and read the trust document and realize that house is going, and it's very valuable, all of a sudden is going to one child, and they're receiving something less. They should understand it probably, but might not. And also, those situations, if not properly planned for, are really ripe for conflict. The other children come in and say, you know what, you moved in with mom. She was weak. She didn't know what she was doing. You influenced her. This isn't what she really wanted. So having the conversations, bring the family in to meet with the lawyer to say this is really your mother's intention now, might help to head off some of that conflict later on. And the other situation, 2 others that I didn't include here, are the family business situation. So parents have perhaps worked all their lives on a family business. One child's involved, but the rest aren't. How to deal with that can be very difficult, and it can be acrimonious afterwards if it's not dealt with properly. I have a situation now where the parents started a business. It's been very successful. 1 out of 4 of their children is involved in the business. The other 3 aren't. And that one child has worked very hard and has made the business even more of a success than it was under the parents' guidance. So they want to treat all 4 equally, but they want to get that business to the one child who's been involved. And they all along were just going to give them the business, thought it would be even if it exceeded his one quarter share of their estate. Well, recently they had a conversation with him and said, we want you to get the business, but if the value of that is in excess of what you would otherwise get from us, we want you to buy part of it from the estate. And they thought that was going to be a very difficult conversation, and I'm sure in some cases it is. But in this particular case, it worked out well. The son understood, is going to buy a piece, we'll see what happens, but is going to buy a piece when they're of the business from their estates. He'll have the whole business and have control of it. He won't have siblings involved in meddling in the business, but everyone will be treated equally, at least in terms of the dollar amounts. So again, that's a situation where the conversation was very helpful. The last one that I don't have here is the tangible personal property. And you hear and read articles about fights over the diamond ring and things like that, and that really does happen. It is, I literally got a phone call yesterday from a woman out of state who's fighting with her two sisters over her mother's estate. It's worth a couple $1 million, the estate. There's a lot of money at stake. That's 45 minutes of the conversation, of an hour conversation, was she wanted to talk about the emerald ring that she was supposed to get. The millions of dollars weren't the topic of conversation. It was the emerald ring that her mother had promised her that she's not getting specifically under this document, and that's what's really bothering her and probably really driving part of it. So having conversations about who's going to get what in terms of those items that may not even be worth a lot in terms of dollars, but are worth a lot in terms of emotional value. Those are the types of conversations to have. I'm working with a family right now where the kids are going to go through the house and kind of mark before death who gets what, because I know there are personalities involved that's going to make that kind of impossible if it's not done now. So the tangible personal property really does drive more acrimony than maybe the dollars would warrant. So those are the types of conversations to have now. And then lastly is the second marriage prenuptial agreement type, and that does require a lot of kind of very specific planning. You have a second spouse, what the children might think is going to happen and the second spouse might think is going to happen are often two very different things. And so perhaps being able to talk about that now and set expectations now will help to prevent some fighting down the road. I know my battery on my watch died the other day, so are we okay? Okay. So that's kind of all the reasons to have a conversation and the very specific types of planning that might result from those conversations. But I also wanted to back up and just talk more in a more basic way about estate planning and what is estate planning, and this may be preaching to the choir for many of you, but it's not just a will and it's not just a trust document. It has various stages to it. So estate planning first is planning for incapacity. So planning when you're not able to make decisions, either financial decisions or perhaps decisions about health. And there are a couple of tools that we often or always put in place to help to plan for that situation, the incapacity situation. And those are a financial power of attorney document, revocable trust, which perhaps could be funded during your life. Your account can go into it. And then, therefore, if you can no longer manage the assets or no longer talk to the investment advisor about the assets, someone who's serving as trustee could do that for you if you're not able to. A healthcare representative, and that's the person who can make decisions, healthcare decisions for you, either routine decisions or kind of the more life-ending heroic measure kinds of decisions when you're not able to make those. The living will, which I'm sure you all have heard about. And also insurance comes into play in terms of planning both for death and as well as for incapacity, especially with younger families. You know, we talk about life insurance quite a bit. In insurance in the pure insurance kind of way, planning and having a pool of assets is something unexpected happens when you're a younger family. But also disability insurance, I talk quite a bit about with younger families. What happens if God forbid, an accident happens? you survive, but you're no longer to make the $150,000 that you were making last year. What happens in that situation? So talking about disability insurance is part of the conversation in planning for incapacity, as well as long-term care insurance. And then, of course, is the aspect of estate planning that we're probably more used to seeing or hearing about, which is planning for the transfer of assets at death. What happens to the assets, and that's the conversation that we were just talking about, how to do that and how to talk to your kids about it, how to talk to family members about it. And that involves the basic documents that you all hear about, the will or a will substitute, meaning perhaps a trust document. You have to decide who's going to get them, what form they're going to take, what form those assets will take when they get them, or whether they should be in a trust or not. Are there friends, are there family members who might receive something? Or is there a charity, a school who you want to benefit at your death? And then the selection, as I alluded to earlier, selection of fiduciaries. Who's going to be your executor for a short period of time to shepherd your estate through the process? Who's going to serve as a trustee who would have a longer term of service? And if you have minor children, in the unlikely event something happens to both of the parents, who do you want to both manage their funds for their benefit and take care of those children if you're not able to? And then Larry mentioned a very important aspect of estate planning, which can be often overlooked, is the coordination of all this, meaning making sure the beneficiary designation comports with the estate planning documents, the will and the trust documents. Because if you might have a will and a trust in place that leaves everything to your kids, but you have a beneficiary designation on a retirement account that leaves that account to the spouse you divorced 15 years ago, well, that's not going to necessarily be revoked because of that divorce, or it won't be. So making sure we coordinate all that, making sure we designate the life insurance to go to that trust you created for the kids in case something happens to you, rather than having it go outright to them at age 18. That's a kind of an essential part of the estate planning process. And just lastly, I just wanted to touch on kind of estate settlement, the different aspects of it, and we won't go into too deeply into that, but you've all heard about Connecticut's we have a probate court system here in Connecticut, providing for a method of paying funeral expenses if your kids aren't able to do that after you're both gone, and estate taxes, which we probably spend too much time talking about in our estate planning practice, but that is obviously still an important aspect of planning. I think Barry is going to.
Want to slip the next slide? Oh, one more slide. We thought we'd wrap up with a couple of thoughts on what we thought is really good practice. We'd encourage you to develop a family missions or a family vision. We'd encourage you to hold family meetings. Explain your thinking and your motivation to your children. Invite discussion with the understanding that you're interested in what your kids have to say, but also with the understanding for your kids that you're making the ultimate decision. These are your assets, and you're planning it the way you want to do. Again, make sure your advisors are working together. Restating that, have the estate plan and make sure your assets are retitled. Organize and write things down so they're easily found. And as Danielle mentioned, think about beneficiaries for non-financial assets. They do cause some of the worst fights. And don't ignore the issue. And finally, a couple of thoughts. When you do have a family meeting, it's not the time to be the family CEO. It's more of a family discussion. If you are having trouble getting into the topic with your kids, try something a little oblique. Go talk about philanthropy first, and then you can get more into actually talking about your estate planning desires. Some people opt for the family meeting, and some people opt for one-on-one. It may be, that one-on-one is really all you can do, given your family situation. But if you do that, consider a letter to all your family members afterwards, so nobody feels like, well, the other guy got more information than I did. And one last thing to help with meetings so they don't become contentious. When you go in, make sure that people realize you're not trying to get to an agreement. You're trying to get opinions. And because if you go in trying to get an agreement, in a meeting, people are going to stake their grounds all during the meeting. And it can make that meeting contentious. But if they realize that it's open and you want to know opinions and others want to hear them, then it can become a much better meeting. You also, I would like to point out that in your books there's more than just the slides. There are a couple of articles and there are a couple of resources that we would encourage you to take advantage of. So please do so. But in the meantime, does anybody have any questions? Sure.
Larry, in scheduling a meeting such as you described, what's the general thinking about including or excluding in-laws, spouses of children?
Well, that's a good question. It can go either way, and it depends on sort of the dynamics of your family. I haven't seen a lot on that, and I haven't advised families on that. But from the little that I've read, some families are very close, and they're willing to invite in-laws, and some it's just the family itself.
One of my partners says repeatedly, it's always the in-laws, it's not the kids who cause the problem. And I think there's some truth to that. If I had to pick one or the other, if you put me to that, I would say I would err on the side of excluding rather than including. But it really does depend on the dynamics and how many people.
And a follow-up question, do these meetings or discussions lead to discussion between and among your children? Because each of them is in the process of creating an estate. They will be affected by the discussion that takes place. It occurs to me that maybe some basis for interaction between the children, either during or after this family meeting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I would encourage that to the extent that it's possible in that particular family. Unfortunately, not all the families can do that, or not all the siblings can do that. But yes, and and maybe we didn't emphasize it enough, is allowing the kids to plan for their own estates is an important aspect of this.
No.
Danielle, in your practice, have you had any experience during the ring example of the Maryland's sort of court? And have you had any experience where families get together and have that before?
Yes, that's.
And is that, have you found, is that preferable to waiting until afterwards?
I'm doing that right now with the family because I know that it's going to be a problem if we wait until afterwards. So the mother is going to go around with each of the 4 children separately and make lists with them. And then she's going to, if there's duplicates, she's going to be the tiebreaker, so to speak. But I have done that, and not a lot, to be honest with you, but where I know, or they know that there's going to be a problem, I would do that. Or at least put if you're anticipating problems, put a method of selection in the documents to, a round robin sort of thing. Yeah. Yeah, it's
Anybody else? Yeah.
You mentioned the process to acknowledge this process for dispute resolution. Have you ever heard of one that was really, perhaps, can you give us some examples of when there is a dispute?
Do you have? I'm trying to think. I don't have a great example for that.
I always say that this, we're called counselors, and in trust and estates, it really is counseling more in the true definition of the word, more than other practices. So we are often mediators to some extent in that, if it can't be resolved within the family situations, and it is feeling your way through a lot of the time. We can't always head off every controversy, but to the extent we can anticipate them and at least let the kids know what the parents' intentions are. So to head off a fight afterwards, we try to do that the best we can. So.
Wouldn't you recommend going with a trust over a will?
Some of the specific situations I mentioned, they're often kind of touted as being a probate avoidance technique, which I don't think is necessarily right for everyone. Is not right for everyone. We use them a lot for tax planning purposes, so maybe a little bit lesser now that there's a very large, over $5 million federal estate tax exemption per person, so that covers most of us. The Connecticut estate tax exemption's $2 million per person, so we still plan for that using trusts often. I also use trusts when, for younger couples, sometimes it's a decision as to how much you want to pay for an estate plan, frankly, but if something happens to me and my kids are going to have a trust, I want it out of the jurisdiction of the probate court, so I often do a separate standalone trust in those situations and direct the assets to that trust. Or if you have a child if you have young children, you want them to get it not at 18, you can use a trust for that purpose. You have a child with particular needs, you can use a trust for that purpose. You want to protect them from themselves, you can use a trust for that purpose. You're worried about their spending. So there's a lot of reasons to use it. It's certainly not right for everyone necessarily.
I think another thing that's interesting is that in a couple books I've read about this is that parents would say, well, I love my kids, everyone gets along great, there'll be no problems, and then something the parents pass. And then money is this own sort of separate animal where there's a lot of just, they see the dollar signs and kids just end up fighting. If a parent pays for medical school for one child and the other child doesn't go to medical school, and it happened 25 years before the parents passed, they'll say, well, that $100,000 should go, I should be compensated for that, but a smart person would then compound what that money was worth 25 years ago to what it would be today. And those are the kind of things that can happen, and oftentimes if that's not expressed, it can lead to some ugly situations.
Yeah, I certainly see that, and that's why I always feel like I'm poking. Everything's fine in the family. Well, we keep poking to make sure that that's the case, and seem nosy sometimes. But fleshing out those issues will help to head off problems down the line. And I always say it does go back to not just paying for college, but what happened when I was a teenager and what mom did for you, and those resentments often don't come out until after the parents are gone. So.
Yeah, that's fun.
Is it advisable to have one or more than one act as power of attorney? And what are the risks in having more than one?
We often have more than one. We say they can act severally, meaning each can act independently. They don't have to act together, so they don't both have to go to the bank to cash a check, that kind of thing. The risks are what you can imagine, that they're doing things that they're not in agreement with, the two of them are not in agreement with. I would never name more than two, and I try not to name more than two, either on a power of attorney or as executor or as trustee. I think it becomes just unwieldy. But two on a power of attorney, one might be in town, the other might not be at a certain point. It's depending on the level of trust and confidence that you have in them. Yeah.
No fixed rule.
No fixed rule. There's no fixed rule for any of it, can you tell?
Anything else? Well, let me wrap up with an idea for a meeting that is a different kind of family meeting. In your booklets there may be a reference to one of the books that we refer people to. It's called Family Wealth. We don't have a tremendous number of copies with us, but if you haven't ever gotten one from us, let us know at some point, and we'd be glad to give you. But they mention in there an idea for a family meeting, and this is between parents or grandparents and grandchildren. And he mentions that meeting is between people who have a common enemy. And so for those of you who have grandchildren or will have grandchildren, this is an idea. Have an annual meeting with your grandchildren without the parents, and give money to your grandchildren to give away. Make them decide who they're going to give it to or what